Hey guys, welcome to Jesus Loves Addicts. This is going to be a two-part episode, so please enjoy part one of our conversation with John Boyle.
When a child is exposed to violence and trauma changes the architecture of the developing brain, right? It rewires neural networks, neural pathways, sensory pathways to allow that child to exist in violence or in trauma.
Yeah.
And so I had a very warped world at this point, and I struggled mightily. I left the violence, but the violence was still going on in my own head, and that continued and still continues now.
Let's be honest about recovery.
The rewards, the challenges.
Let's talk about our failures.
We are flawed people, after all.
Let's challenge the stigmas that weigh us down.
Because while most of us are looked at,
Few of us are seen.
Let's talk about addiction.
And how Christ overcomes our weaknesses.
Because we are loved.
because we are loved.
Because we are loved.
We are loved.
We are
Because
loved.
we are loved.
Hi, my name's John Boyle, and I grew up in a violent home. And like anyone who grew up in a violent home, I thought that hope was a fairy tale. But what I've come to learn, being a follower of Jesus Christ, is that hope is being able to see light despite all the darkness. So if you're struggling, I would recommend placing your faith in Him and arming yourself with the Word of God and fighting with everything you have.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Jesus Loves Addicts. We're really glad you're here, and I am thrilled, as always, to welcome another guest with a story of hope. I'm always struck by the vast array of personalities we get on here, and it really just speaks to the fact that, again, addiction is without bias as to who it'll attach itself to. So this gentleman that we have today, his name is John Boyle. Again, I'm super excited about this. He is an author of his story. He wrote a book called Appalachian Kid. In this story, it's wonderful. I got this book thinking, okay, this is going to be specifically about him overcoming addiction. And by the way, that story within the story is woven into this book for sure, but it is much bigger than that. It's about life in West Virginia and sort of overcoming negative voices of childhood and the journey through faith to convert those into the truth that Jesus tells us. So I am really excited about hearing him tell his story, but I love the subtitle on this book. So above Appalachian Kid, it says, How Hope Changed Everything. And you've also often heard me say that Jesus Loves Addicts, there we go, is nothing if it's not a podcast about hope. And so wonderful to welcome you here, John. I'm super excited about diving into your story, which has a beginning, and thank you for being so bold and sharing it not only in your book, but seeing you speak. And the beginning is not as pretty as the end. Can you take us from the start and where your story begins?
Absolutely. So my story, it basically starts in the mountains of West Virginia. I grew up in a mining and farming community. It was very rural. And it was a place that was impoverished and rather hopeless, right? And how we equate and see hope in a worldly sense, and how we equate and see hope in a faith sense, we'll save that for a bit, right? But as I could see my environment, it was a hopeless place. There were a lot of people who were hard hit. There were a lot of people who were impoverished. There were a lot of people who were unemployed, and there were a lot of difficulties in that community. And that is what I saw as a young man. But in the same sense, I saw many people in the community help others. They leaned in instead of closing their door on their neighbor, right? And so I saw these stories all along of people helping people, and it really shaped the man I am today. So I'm very blessed looking back as to the area I grew up, the friends that God put in my life, and God blessed me with many active family members who leaned into my life and helped me. and they have since passed, right?
Can I pause you right there
Sure.
for a second? Because that's something new that you just spoke about that I really like. So you were raised in kind of an impoverished part of West Virginia, and it's easy to adopt kind of a dismal vision of life in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But what there was, for all of its poverty, I love what you just said, there was also this element of community that you don't often see in more well-to-do, and I don't mean to be stereotypical. I'm sure there are some wonderful communities out there of all sorts, but you do get a different level of community sometimes in those areas. Is that, and you saw that?
Absolutely. I am friends with the same guys that I went to first and second and third grade with.
Neat.
I'm friends with the same people that I went to Bible school with, like the first day of Bible school.
Yeah.
Right? I'm 48 years old. The people that I have met and become friends with in the mountains of West Virginia, I've never parted with. Wow. It is a wonderful place, and it is full of wonderful people.
Amen.
It is just an area that is hard hit.
Yeah.
So, John, you say that the area was impoverished. Was your family poor?
I think in a sense, to just kind of put it in a purview, I believe we were maybe an upper middle class family. Right, my dad ran a small construction company. He was a coal miner most of his life.
Yeah.
He had a business. My family had a business that was founded by his grandfather, but it certainly wasn't large, and it's not a large market either. And
Right.
so that was just a means that my family had.
But your needs were met and
make a living. Yes.
food was on the table.
Yes.
Yeah.
My needs were met. Food was on the table. My dad was a hardworking man, and he was a provider. And I am thankful that God gave me that in my life.
Definitely.
Yes.
But just as we talked about kind of bright lights within dismal communities in terms of their appearance, that is kind of a bright spot in your family life, but there are some dark elements here as well.
Yes, there are. And I didn't know that right off the bat, right?
Sure.
I just grew up in a home, and I was given an environment, and that was my norm, right? But I started to learn as I got into early grade school, when I would go to my friends' houses and I would have a sleepover, and I would see the interactions between them and their parents versus me and mine. It was bifurcated. There were large differences, and my story is not to pick on my parents whatsoever. My story is about the goodness of God.
Amen.
And so to display the goodness of God, I think the best way to do that is show them where you were
Amen.
before Him, and then show them where you were
Definitely.
after He's been in your life, right? So just growing up, I grew up in a violent home. My mother oftentimes was the perpetrator of the violence. And from a very early age, I chose to not take it. I defended myself to the best of my ability against a grown adult.
Now I've heard, and I'm sure you're going to get into that, so don't let me derail you, but a question comes to mind. I've heard victims of childhood violence talk about trying to defend themselves, but oftentimes that led to the worsening of the attack. Is that...
By far. That was my experience, yes. That enraged my mother. It enraged her, and it made my treatment far worse. But I don't believe I was wired to accept it. And I had younger siblings, and it wasn't a thought on my mind that if they were given those same circumstances that I did, I would become the lightning rod.
Did you feel kind of protective of them?
I felt a sense that I needed to protect them, yes, because they were smaller than me.
Yeah.
And I knew what it was doing to me, and I knew what it would do to somebody smaller than me. So yes, I didn't even think about it. I did it.
Yeah.
So were you the main recipient of this violence, or was it happening to all your siblings?
It was happening to everybody in our home, my father included.
Right.
Your father included. He was
father
abused
included.
by your mother as well.
Yes.
Was he much more passive?
Well, he was grown, and I don't think it hurt as bad.
Yeah.
Right. And he could walk away, or he could do something about it. there was no walking away for children in the middle of nowhere in mountains of West Virginia. Right.
So was there alcohol or drugs involved with this?
No, sir, there wasn't.
Yeah.
No, my parents didn't drink. They didn't use drugs. I never saw them use either.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was just a part of daily life.
Which is an interesting component, isn't it? Because we oftentimes want to kind of hang it on something else, but really there's just brokenness in the heart of man, and that's what you're seeing in your parents. So how did that play out as you?
So that's a great question. Once I was in third or fourth grade, midway through grade school, I really started to disassociate away from home. I started to unplug from my surroundings at school and try to make sense of the world that I was living in at home, right? So I would get a break from it in school, at least grade school. Now, junior high was way different. But in grade school, I would disassociate from what the teacher was thinking, and I would try to make sense of my world. And so I would be parked in my head. And so the teacher would obviously see I wasn't paying attention. If I was asked a question, I wouldn't know how to answer it.
Right.
I would not do my homework. I would not focus. I was often sent to the, back in West Virginia in the 80s, their terms were rather harsh, but I was sent to a remedial reading class. I was sent to a slow learning class, and I would get in there, and the teachers that taught those classes would ask me to read this or ask me to solve a problem. I'd do it, and they'd send me back to my regular classroom. But by the time I got to sixth grade, I remember, and I spoke to your group earlier about this, Paul, my sixth grade teacher at a parent-teacher conference looked at both of my parents and said, "This kid will never make it to college. You all are wasting your time trying to teach him anything."
So
rather harsh.
Well, so he was making
that was their take.
He was making a judgment about your home life or your intelligence.
My intelligence, and it was a she. Yes,
she.
Yeah.
Which wasn't really a comment about your intelligence at all. If I can just pause and you mentioned dissociation, and so just for anybody who's listening who may not be familiar with that, you can be in the middle of a situation, but mentally you are not around, right?
That's right.
You are somewhere else, and many people who experience various traumas, that is something that happens. Your brain learns to split and typically it'll happen in a place of trauma. You'll disappear from that place mentally, even though you're there physically. But for you, your brain was trying to work through this in the moments of where it wasn't happening. And so you would split. And so it wasn't an intelligence thing at all. It was that mentally you were not in class.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
I mean, I knew it wasn't intelligence. I didn't know.
No, I know.
If that's what the teacher meant. So, when you would disassociate, did you have an active fantasy life in your head, or were you just kind of checked out?
I was just checked out.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what I was thinking during those disassociated moments, but it's trying to find comfort in your own realm when you can.
Yeah, sure.
Right. I grew up Catholic. Right. And that's the other thing that gave me difficulty was I thought that, I thought what many children think growing up who, learn about God and Jesus, but at the same time, they're experiencing something in their world that's completely contrary to what God and Jesus, the lives that they want for us, what they teach. Right. And so there was this bifurcation between these two different worlds that I had a hard time making sense of, why would God allow me to be in this environment? And anyone in that environment would think that it's completely normal, but you
especially
feel,
a child.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. But you feel in those moments that you're not worthy, that you're broken and others aren't, that the people are better than you. You have a very high internal shame level. You have these thoughts that, it's just not you, John. It's just not you. You're going to be someone who's pumping gas or driving a truck. I mean, these are the things that I heard right when my report cards came home. And my teachers back in the 1980s, they didn't pull any punches. They were witnessing me disassociating in class and equating that with laziness. And when those comments come home to a hardworking coal miner, that meant solitary confinement, and I'm going to study from the second I get off the bus until I go to bed. And so those dynamics negatively played off one another, and it led to this negative spiral through, the later part of elementary school and well into junior high until I ultimately got out of my home at 15.
You got out of your home at 15?
Yes, sir, I did. My father had gone to a military boarding school back in the 1960s. And so he was an advocate of having that experience of going away and getting an education. So he witnessed, because I defended myself on a regular basis with my mother, and he would get called in from work or a work trip to deal with an altercation that happened in our house on a regular basis. He knew that I needed to leave that home.
So he helped facilitate that.
So he did facilitate that, yes.
And so you went to the same military school?
I didn't go to a military school. I went to the closest boarding school that existed. It's still there. My son actually just graduated from it
awesome.
Back in May of 24. It was called the Kiski School, and it's outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Was there an immediate sense of relief for you in evacuating the house, or was there mixed feelings?
There was an immediate sense. I did my book, quote unquote, grand opening at the Kiski School at their library. And one of my teachers who I had is still there. And he attended my book opening. And he was the one who I met first. He was standing outside of Clark Hall. And I was sent over to Clark Hall. I was the first student there that day to check in. And he had this Kiski ball cap on, and he was just welcoming. And it was almost like this symbolic torch that, like this memory that I have, that it was a symbolic torch of me leaving a violent home and embarking on this journey that would become my life. And I told this story at my book opening, and I looked over at Mr. Orsatti. Everybody calls him Mr. O, and is the man that I first met. And I was telling the story of, I left this dynamic that was highly unfruitful, and I came to this place that gave me hope, and I could breathe, and I could be my own person, and I could not be weighed down by these thoughts of people who are thinking I'm a daydreamer or that I'm lazy. I am fighting something that they don't know. And he didn't know how I grew up. He didn't know what he did. When I looked at him after saying that, the guy was just crying his eyes out. And God uses all kinds of people to get you where he wants you to get. He was one of those guys. So yes, you want to talk about an elephant getting off of your chest? It was one of those moments.
So at 15, you're going into 8th or 9th?
I was going into 10th grade.
Oh, into 10th grade.
I was going into 10th grade at 15.
And the violence in the home, how old were you when that started?
Earliest memory.
Earliest memory.
Yes,
so
sir.
4, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
So you've had 10 years plus of traumatic, violent exposure. Okay.
That's correct. And for your listeners, when a child is exposed to violence, violence and trauma changes the architecture of the developing brain, right? And it's now found that the trauma actually causes a child's brain to it rewires neural networks, neural pathways, sensory pathways to allow that child to
cope,
exist in violence or in trauma.
Yeah.
And so I had a very warped world at this point, and I struggled mightily. I left the violence, but the violence was still going on in my own head, and that continued and still continues now.
One of the things you brought up in your talk was that there was both violence in the home, and then you were a fighter outside of the home, right? You talk about kind of being a fighter. Did that also stop in this other school, or was there still a angst in you that...
Yes, it stopped in this school that was not accepted. The man who ran it was a man named Mr. Pigeon. He did not mince words about if you fought, you would be thrown out of this school. And so it was a safe haven for me.
Yeah.
I was not picked on there. I was not bullied. I was not told I was dumb or stupid. I was not told I was going to be a truck driver. I was not told any of those things. My first year there, the head of school would meet you every month and give you your grades. And I was next to last of my class the entire first year. And the man would only ask about my effort to my teachers. And he was a big proponent of effort. And he said, look, if you can get your effort grades up, you'll be my hero. And eventually I did. And then he said it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how to study. I was lost in all my classes. I still had this trauma going on in my head. And so I learned how to cope with it over time. But really who I credit are all the mentors I had in that school.
Sure.
They completely changed the trajectory of where my life was headed, or where I perceived it was headed. God knew where I was going. I didn't.
It's one of the things I love about your book. It's really, in part, a testimony of the importance of a supporting cast, right? You talk about so many people that are sort of airlifted into your life at the right times, right? That just, it's also a call to action for Christians, I think, to be awake and see where we can step into other people's lives, right? In that same way. I'd like to take a moment to recognize a major podcast sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by America's Thrift Stores, your go-to option for decluttering and giving back. If you have a closet bursting at the seams or a garage that's seen better days, we've got the perfect solution for you.
That's right. America's Thrift Stores makes it easy to clear out the clutter and make a positive impact in your community. Whether you're cleaning out your wardrobe, downsizing your living space, or just looking to give back, America's Thrift Stores has you covered.
And here's the best part. You've got options. Schedule a hassle-free home pickup, drop off your items at one of their convenient donation sites, or swing by an America's Thrift Store to donate in person. No matter which way you choose, you're making a difference.
Absolutely. Every donation you make to America's Thrift Stores directly benefits charities in your area, such as the Home of Grace and other fantastic organizations dedicated to helping those in need.
For example, donations made to America's Thrift Stores in southern Mississippi help the Home of Grace provide support and assistance to individuals facing drug and alcohol addiction. Your contributions make a real impact on their mission to provide freedom from addiction through Christ-centered recovery. So not only are you decluttering your life, but you're also helping build a stronger and more supportive community.
It's truly a double blessing. So what are you waiting for? Clean out that closet, clear out that garage, and make a positive difference in your community by donating to America's Thrift Stores.
Visit America's Thrift Stores online to schedule a home pickup, locate a donation site near you, or get directions to one of their store locations.
America's Thrift Stores, where giving back never goes out of style.
So this, I know the PTSD, right? You actually talk about complex PTSD in your book and how you suffer from that. So you come out of this stressful situation, but as you say, the brain doesn't immediately turn off.
That's right.
Quick question: have you been introduced to substances yet? Has that entered your life yet, or are we just still struggling?
No.
Okay.
I maybe drank 3 or 4 times in high school. I really did not like the taste of beer.
Yeah.
I was not somebody who dabbled in drugs.
Yeah.
They really weren't prevalent where I was from. I mean, marijuana, I believe, was, but anything else, the Oxycontin didn't exist at this point in time. No. And I really didn't know anybody who did use drugs. And so it was just not available to me.
This might be a little off the beaten path, but I wonder if, so not the fighting in the home, the fighting outside of the home, even though you were also defending yourself then, right? You were being bullied and things like that. But I wonder if that fighting didn't almost serve a similar role as drugs and alcohol. Did you get a sense of release by fighting? Was it always a really problematic thing, or was there a sense of...
It was a problematic thing. I did not get a release or find any enjoyment with it. It was a source of great anxiety.
Okay.
Even to me, the threat of a fight was worse than the actual fight.
Okay.
The threat of being hit was always worse than the actual action of being hit.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
So then that was just more of the cage that you found yourself in.
That's
so
right.
now you go to this school, there's this immediate freedom. How does the PTSD play out now in your...
Well, I didn't know I had PTSD or CPTSD until I was 34. And so I just understood that I had these symptoms that not everybody else had. And so I bottled it up because, well, let's just face it, life in the 1980s and the 1990s, the onus on mental health just wasn't there.
Yeah.
Right? And so, there weren't mental health professionals at my school. When you grow up in a violent home, going to the doctor, going to a therapist, those weren't actions that, were at the forefront of my parents' mind. So I dealt with it. And, my dad always had this saying, and I'm not finding fault with him whatsoever, to toughen up, right? That's what coal miners say.
Suck it up.
Toughen up, suck it up, do what you got to do.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And I swept all these internal feelings and thoughts and dysphoric type issues that I had in my world. I just swept them under the rug. I'll deal with them tomorrow. So the first predominant symptom I have PTSD started in high school, really, and it started with insomnia. And then dysphoria would kick in. And really, I guess for your listeners, dysphoria is the best explanation I've heard is it's feelings without explanation, right? It's just you're lost. And the way it kind of resonates with me is I have this internal knack to feel not wanted because of my early childhood, and so that has always been with me. By the time I was a junior, for the first time, I had suicide ideation, and I was actually driving with my father looking at colleges. And I went to a visit at Virginia Tech, and we were coming back, and it was rainy, and it was foggy, and it was just depressing out. And we're going through the mountains, and there's no leaves on the trees, and it's just
bleak.
Bleak, yeah. And I started to have these thoughts, and I'm like, oh boy, I can't say that. Mm-hmm. Boy, they're going to put me in the loony bin, and I'll never get out, right? Got to hide that. I got into college. My insomnia got worse, and I started to have I didn't start to have flashbacks until I had my first son, 28 or 29. And when I could see my son and realize that when I was that age, I was being treated a certain way, that would trigger a lot of flashbacks and the treatment of what I incurred at his age. And so, yeah, it just kind of progressed and got worse over time. And I believe it was there all along. I just didn't exactly know what it was or how to pinpoint it. Or I had ways of sweeping it under the rug until it became so pronounced I couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a great way to put it too, right? We almost think that sometimes leads to people thinking they're crazy in the worst of that definition, right? Because something's happening, we just don't know what to call it. We don't know that there's a reason for this, and so we feel, So I appreciate that. So you're in school then. When do substances get introduced to you, or alcohol? I think was the predominant.
It was.
Does that get introduced to you in the school, or was it?
No. After I graduated high school, I worked for my family business, who pivoted from coal mining into building roads. And so when I was 18, I worked on an asphalt paving crew, and it was common for everybody to drink after work.
Sure.
And so I started to be invited to have a 22-ounce beer or a 40-ounce beer or something like that, and I would drink it and go home after work. And so I started to realize that the euphoria that introduced into my mind and how it put those thoughts at bay that I had been troubled with my whole childhood and my teenage years, I used the term painting over rust. It helped me put those feelings at bay and it replaced it with euphoria for a fleeting amount of time.
Yeah.
And so when I got into college my freshman year, I really started drinking on a more regular basis. It wasn't so much binge drinking, it was more drinking to numb. And that would help me sleep. And, well, I perceived that it helped me sleep, but it brought a myriad of other issues, one of them being I was arrested my 4th day of college for driving under the influence.
So you were using it as a medication basically from the start?
More or less. Yeah. And I don't know that I even knew I was doing it. It just helped me feel better than I naturally did. Right.
Yeah.
And so I just didn't know any better. It's the only thing I'd ever tried that helped move the needle.
It was working. It was doing something.
It did something
that you liked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let me talk about the parallel thing that's happening before we jump back into your addiction.
Okay.
And sorry, I asked about the substances. I know I definitely want to know that. But here you are now in college, right? And this is a guy who in 6th grade was told he'd never get there.
Right.
What was the school called that you went to, the boarding school?
Kiski School.
Kiski School.
Yes.
Was it there that positive messaging started coming in? Like, where did you begin to believe that that was a possibility for you?
So my junior year, that's a great question. My junior year, I decided to play varsity football. And so I had a football coach who was on the tail end of his career. He was a very accomplished man by the name of Chuck Clausing. Chuck Clausing's actually in the College Football Hall of Fame. And he coached high school football his last couple years before he retired.
Wow.
His grandson was our quarterback, and he's now, I think he's the head coach at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh of that team. So I started to pick up in preseason before my junior year of what this man did every day to succeed. And Stephen Covey, one of his 7 habits of highly effective people, is chance favors the prepared, right? And he was a man who prepared. And his record in his college and high school football years is like unparalleled. He was very successful. He coached one team in southwestern Pennsylvania. I want to say it was Braddock High School, and he was like 61-1. He was featured in Sports Illustrated in the 1960s for being a very effective, coach. He just prepared, right? Yeah. So I'm watching this man like prepare us to play these teams, and I just really bought in. And so I had been taught all year by these mentors my sophomore year, going into my junior year, of what I needed to succeed. I just needed to put it together from the start. And this one guy in particular, his name was Dr. Lane. He was a dorm parent, and he taught me how to study in the evenings instead of, getting on me because I didn't do my homework or because I wasn't prepared. And so all these things kind of came together in a perfect world, and I made the honor roll. My first year, my junior year, my first semester. And when I told Dr. Lane this, I mean, he was a burly man, a smoker, beard, man's man, right? I told Dr. Lane that walking out of football practice one day, and he dropped his bags and gave me a hug.
That's awesome.
Those moments shaped who I am today, right?
Yeah.
It gave me hope, and I didn't have hope, right? And so, I tear up when I say it.
Sure.
Not because it makes me sad. In a way I felt I didn't deserve it, but and those people didn't care. They leaned in and they helped me where I was, and they helped me get there. And so my junior year, for the first time, I had good grades. Never made the honor roll. I mean, anybody who heard that was just flabbergasted. Forget unbelievable. They're like, John did what?
Yeah.
Right? And so that's where it started. And I've really never had bad grades again.
And it just goes to show, like you said earlier, being a call to action for Christians.
Yes.
Because a lot of people, all they need is just a little bit of success to show them that there's hope, that they can do whatever that it is. And a lot of times it takes somebody else pouring into them. Because if left to their own devices, they're not going to succeed because they don't believe that they can.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it really highlights, the Bible talks about the power of the tongue and how we're supposed to speak life into each other. And so in your childhood, you're being death is being spoken into you, right? The death of growth. And so that's what you saw. And then you get to this new school and people start to speak life into you.
That's right.
Just that little tongue steering that rudder. And it changed the rudder on your ship and gave you a sense of hope. I love that, you know, and it's so, so important. So, thank you for that. 'Cause it's so, I think it's a major component to everybody's story, or the parallels, right? Addiction is often just a symptom of the bigger issue.
Agreed.
And so, you know, here we're really overcoming all that negativity, that violence, that darkness that you were exposed to. But it's hard to shake. And that's what, you know, we're about to, you know, we still live in a broken world. We're still exposed to brokenness. So you have these people speak life into you. It gives you a different view of your future. You end up in college, but you still have one hand in the cookie jar, right?
That's right.
And so tell us about that.
So I get through college. I graduate college in 1999.
But you got a DUI your fourth
day of college.
So
didn't even make it to the first weekend. Yeah. That was humiliating to have your name in the paper. Driving under the influence wasn't quite as frowned upon in the 1990s as it is today. I'm not trying to, in any way absolve my behavior in that. But it was, I think, quite common then, and it is really frowned upon today and penalized today.
Well, would you say too, and I'm sorry, I know I keep interrupting, but it's so fascinating, right? Having read your story too, there's little things. Would you say too that you're still in West Virginia, right?
I am.
And this is a working man's area, and so they're the mental framework there is work hard, play hard.
That's right.
And one of the unfortunate occasions of playing hard might be a DUI. So would I be fair to say that it's also probably not that uncommon that people
it's not.
Yeah, and so
it's not. West Virginia University is typically ranked as one of the top 5 party schools in the United States, as prescribed by the Princeton Review, USA Today. I'm not proud of that fact, right? But that's the fact of the matter.
Right.
And so
part of the culture.
It is a big party culture place, and everybody does it who goes to school there. And so I made some poor choices in college, and I had to learn from that. And I had to, make a self-reflection that this is not the person that I strive to be. And I've got to clean this up, and I've got to be better. And had I have continued that behavior, I wouldn't have graduated from the engineering school, for sure.
Right. So did you stop drinking through the rest of school, or you just were able to keep it under wraps at that point?
In parts, I still used alcohol on a regular basis to cover up my symptoms. And in particular, I didn't mention this one earlier, but I had a broken fight or flight response in college. My heart would just start racing out of nowhere, right? Like someone called in a bomb threat, is what I said earlier to your group. And it really felt that way. There would be no circumstances that led me to believe that I was in danger.
That's a classic PTSD.
It is. And I didn't know how it was triggered. I didn't know any of those things until decades later.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But man, even if, it's impressive that you graduated college.
It is.
Because drinking like that, using it as a medication, that's a fast track to problems.
And it was.
Yeah.
it was for sure. My 20s and 30s were riddled with them.
Yeah.
And it all stemmed from alcohol.
Before we go any further, let's take a minute to address the man or the woman listening to today's episode and wishing for a better life. Or maybe addiction has completely overtaken a family member or a friend.
You are not alone. As you may know, the Jesus Loves Addicts podcast is produced by the Home of Grace, a Christ-centered addiction recovery program in South Mississippi with over 60 years of experience.
The Home of Grace has residential programs ranging from 30 days to 12 months. With 2 separate campuses for men and women, they are fully staffed with caring individuals who want nothing more than to guide you to a life of recovery.
Services include individual and group counseling, marriage and family counseling, classes, workshops, GED, and workforce training, all grounded in biblical principles.
And because of donations from the community, the cost of the program is incredibly affordable.
Thousands of alumni from across the country can tell you there is no other program in the world quite like the Home of Grace.
If you want to start a new path to recovery, don't wait. Speak with an admission specialist today. Visit homeofgrace.org or call 833-55-GRACE to talk with someone.
That's 833-55-GRACE. Call the Home of Grace today. So we have a unique opportunity with you, John, to kind of, again, parallel walk the addiction and the PTSD. We don't often get to dive into that. And so that symptom you're talking about, it's interesting because most people would think, well, he's out of harm's way. This should be a time of rest. But the reality is for somebody who grows up in violence, moments of calm are not peaceful. They are time to be anxious because you're always waiting for the next shoe to drop.
Calm is noisy to someone who has my disorder.
Correct. So calm is suspicious, right? We don't trust calm.
That's right.
So yeah, I appreciate that. So, but like Ross said, here you go, you power through and you graduate college.
Yes.
And dive into what?
So I went into the family business because I had worked there from 13 until 22 when I graduated college. And I met my first wife probably at 25. We got married maybe at 26, had a son at 28. In the same year that I was 28, I was a vice president in the family business by then. And my father called me up one day and he said, I need you. I was in my office. He said, I need you to come up to the hospital. And so I drove up there. It was maybe 8 a.m. and it was probably June. I would say it was June of 2006, somewhere in there. My dad asked me to get in his truck. It was parked right outside the front door of the hospital. And he was in a hospital gown, holding an IV tower, smoking a cigarette with oxygen in his nose. And my dad was an interesting individual, very tough man. I mean, like the Terminator tough.
Yeah.
And he just looked at me and he said, I had a heart attack last night, and in doing my blood work, they've also found where I have colon cancer. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what to tell you. You're in charge. Good luck. He went on to a hospital, which was about an hour away, and then he ultimately ended up at Duke Medical Center for a long time. And he survived it. But from that day forward, I was in his spot.
Oh, wow.
So at 28, going on 29, I was not only a father and in an early marriage, but I was running a company that at the time it probably had 100 employees.
Wow. No pressure.
And I was I was not an emotionally intelligent, emotionally blossomed leader. I was someone who was just a process-driven engineer who wanted to make things better, and I went about my day like a robot. And then I went from that position to being a leader of people, and
very different.
Yeah, it was very different. Yeah. And I had to learn the skills of how to teach someone how to do something instead of picking up the ball and doing something myself. But I had a lot of good people around me. That has been a theme in my life, and the good people around me helped me get through that, not only get through it, but succeed. We were in a region that had an energy boom. So we went from having 100 employees to about 600 in 5 years.
Wow.
Right? And
pretty good sized company.
My marriage was put in a pressure cooker because of that. And I didn't know I had PTSD on top of it. At 25, I started seeking help for these symptoms. Doctors would call it, as I said earlier, a disguised presentation. Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, talks about a lot about disguised presentations and why people with CPTSD are so often misdiagnosed. And it's because of the disguised presentation. And I try to say that in interviews when I get a chance, because sometimes people that are listening or people that are fighting this don't even know what they have.
Right.
I didn't for a decade.
They're
I was
only
misdiagnosed.
They're going to multiple doctors and only giving a little piece of the puzzle to each one, not even realizing that's what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. And when you grow up in trauma, you have this high pain threshold. So even though some of these symptoms might be bothering you, you're only really talking about the one that's most pronounced. Right? And that's what I was doing. So I would be prescribed medications, whether it was an SSRI or whether it was something for depression. And I didn't really have anxiety or depression. It was all these symptoms that I had. And so it was really dampening a disturbed psychology. Really, it was not doing anything. It was just making me slow, like I didn't have blood in my veins, but like molasses.
Yeah, that's a pet peeve of mine. Yeah,
yeah. So I found that, like, hey, well, if I just get off these things and start using alcohol on a daily basis versus 3, 4, 5 days a week, well, I can paint over rust effectively every day. And so
it's not perfect, but hey, it works.
So I did it. Yeah, and I regret highly taking that approach.
So is this where your addiction ramps up then?
It did.
And you're how old now? About 29, 30?
I'm 29, 30. At this point, maybe 31. By the time I was 24, 25, I was drinking about every day. And so by my late 20s, when my dad stepped down and I'm in charge and I'm a parent and I'm a husband, I am drinking every day.
Oh, so you were already deep in it when that responsibility hit you. Okay.
Yes.
And now it just went to the next level.
Right. And I wouldn't say during the week I was getting drunk, but I was on the high side of social.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And then on my weekends, I'd have some blackout nights too, right? Got to get that out of the way on the weekends so I can function for work.
So at this point of your life, how did faith and like your faith, like, was that a part of your life at all?
No, I replaced it with drinking.
Work and drinking.
I had no faith life. Yeah. I grew up Catholic. My wife and I were married in the Catholic Church, my first wife. But really, after college, I stopped going to church. I might have gone in the holidays because my parents did or my family did. I still tried to have that family connection. I don't now. But by the time I was in my late 20s, no, I was not going to church, probably even at Christmas or Easter.
Okay.
I didn't have a faith life. If I prayed, it was a Hail Mary prayer that, only for me.
Right.
God, I need you to do this tomorrow.
Please.
I need this job for my company.
Right.
It was not, what do you want from me? How can I serve you? Right? So I was very selfish at that point in my life. And I was divorced at 32. And
now, was the addiction a big part of that? Was there?
I would say the biggest part of it was having PTSD and having different temperaments. I was not someone who was physically abusive to my wife or my son. I didn't want to replicate that behavior, but I would say that I was a very scary individual when I had too much to drink or when I processed certain things, violence being one of them. If I would see it in a movie or see it in person, I would have a hard time coming to terms with it in my own head. So I would have reactions to things. What I'm trying to say is, PTSD is a disorder of reactions.
Yeah.
And I think some of those reactions, because I didn't know how to handle it, led to that. But also, I became a workaholic. I became disassociated in my marriage. I would do what I felt comfortable doing, and I would not always be there for my partner. And look, that's not fair to her. I don't blame her.
Sure.
I don't blame her for leaving at all. So we were divorced when my son was 3 or 4. I was in my early 30s. And then I basically had my son half of the week. We had joint custody. My wife wanted my son to have a dad in his life, and so she gave me joint custody. And I took all the time with my son I could. If I didn't have my son, I was working or drinking. It was one or the other. And I did that until my liver started failing.
Did you ever find that the priorities got flipped? Like I know I talked to a lot of parents and they talk about, it breaks their heart, but they remember times where they chose the drug or the alcohol over the child. Just in that moment, they needed it so bad. It wasn't that,
Yeah.
And so they missed things. Is that?
I didn't miss anything. I was not somebody who drank and was late for work. I could drink until 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning. Now, I don't know what kind of condition I was when I got up the next day at 7 or 8, but I would get up and I would do what I had to do.
Okay.
I was not as present as I should have been as a father.
Sure.
Like mentally and interactively. I did not have the energy that I do now with my younger son. You know, there were some days where I was hungover and laying around watching movies with my kid, not playing ball. But I was there.
Yeah.
I was there. But I was not at all the example of who I should have been. And I would get angry sometimes at my son for screwing up and not be physical with him, but be more verbal than I should. And you know, when I got sober, it was one of the things that I did address with him and apologize. And when I did, man, I broke down in tears because just the admission of that, like you're saying, Paul, it was a big thing, not for me to get off my chest, but to come to terms with and share with my son in hopes that he doesn't make that mistake that I did.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our conversation with John Boyle. Part 2 will be next week. Please, if you're not, please subscribe to our channel so you will be notified when this episode is released. See y'all next week.